January 1944. 30,000 feet above central Germany, the sky is already crowded. Silver aircraft stretch from horizon to horizon, their wings catching the pale winter sun. Engine noise becomes a single, continuous sound, mechanical, steady, relentless. Vapor trails cut long white scars through the blue. Below them, the land is still dark. Factories idle. Rail yards breathe faint smoke into the cold air. Inside the German High Command, there is no alarm. Not yet. For months, American bombers have come in daylight, flying straight and predictably. They have been met by flak, by fighters, by statistics. Losses carefully counted, claims carefully reported. The conclusion, repeated in briefings and memoranda, is reassuring. The Americans are brave, but wasteful. Their precision is exaggerated. Their effect, tolerable. Oil plants can be repaired. Refineries can be dispersed. Production always resumes. On this morning, however, the bombers are not heading for cities or submarine pens. Their course is deliberate. Their targets are narrow. Industrial complexes tied not to morale, but to motion. Fuel that turns propellers, engines, and armored columns. By the time the first bombs fall, something subtle has already changed. Not the war, the assumptions behind it. And those assumptions were about to be tested against reality. By the time American bombers began appearing regularly over the Reich, Germany's war effort was already bound to a single fragile equation. Without fuel, nothing moved. From the first days of rearmament in the 1930s, German planners understood the problem. The Reich possessed coal in abundance, but almost no natural petroleum. Domestic crude oil production met only a fraction of peacetime demand. In war, it would be catastrophically insufficient. Unlike Britain or the United States, Germany had no global oil network to draw upon, no secure maritime lifelines immune to blockade. The solution was synthetic fuel. Through a vast industrial effort led by IG Farben and supported directly by the Nazi state, Germany developed coal hydrogenation plants capable of converting lignite and hard coal into aviation gasoline, diesel, and lubricants. Facilities such as Leuna, Politz, Merseburg, Brux, and Blackhammer became the unseen arteries of the Wehrmacht. By 1943, synthetic fuel accounted for more than half of Germany's total petroleum supply and nearly all of its aviation gasoline. Yet this vulnerability was rarely spoken of in public. Inside the German leadership, it was managed through confidence rather than contingency. The memory of the First World War shaped this attitude. Strategic bombing, as envisioned in the 1910s, had failed to break industrial societies. Zeppelins and Gotha bombers had terrorized civilians, but produced limited military results. In the interwar years, Germany's air doctrine evolved accordingly. The Luftwaffe was built not as a strategic bombing force, but as a tactical instrument, supporting ground forces, destroying enemy airfields, and striking operational targets close to the front. This belief hardened into orthodoxy. Long-range bombing, German officers argued, was inefficient, inaccurate, and economically unsound. War would be decided at the front, not from the sky. When Britain began its bombing campaign in 1940, German assessments appeared to confirm this view. The early RAF raids were small, imprecise, and costly. Daylight attacks were abandoned after heavy losses. Night bombing, while safer, proved inaccurate. Entire cities were struck, but factories often survived. Production dipped, then recovered. Albert Speer, appointed Minister of Armaments in 1942, took pride in this resilience. Dispersal, rapid repair, and decentralized management became his answers to air attack. Reports to Hitler reflected this confidence. Bombing, Speer argued, was an irritant, not a war-winning weapon. Hermann Göring, head of the Luftwaffe, went further. He dismissed the notion that enemy bombers could paralyze the Reich.
Germany, he claimed, would shoot them down in unsustainable numbers. Flak belts thickened, fighter interceptors were deployed. Each raid became an opportunity to demonstrate control. When the Americans entered the air war over Europe in 1942, German analysts initially saw no reason to revise their conclusions. The U.S. Army Air Forces arrived with bold claims: precision daylight bombing, tightly packed formations, self-defending bombers. To the German command, it sounded theoretical, unproven, almost naive. Early American raids seemed to validate the skepticism. Losses were high. Targets were often missed. Factories resumed output. From Berlin, the air war still looked survivable. What German planners failed to fully confront was not the bomb tonnage already falling, but the logic behind where it would eventually land. That realization would not come immediately, but the conditions for it were already in place.
The Americans came to the air war with a different theory and an unusual confidence in machines. Before a single U.S. bomber crossed the English coast, the idea had already been debated in classrooms and manuals. At the Air Corps Tactical School in the 1930s, American officers argued that modern industrial economies were not resilient webs, but systems with critical nodes. Destroy the right points, power, transportation, fuel, and the entire structure would fail. Precision, not terror, was the key. Bombing would be selective, deliberate, and decisive. This doctrine shaped everything the U.S. Army Air Forces built. The Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress and the consolidated B-24 Liberator were designed to fly high, in formation, bristling with defensive guns. Their mission was not to evade fighters, but to fight through them. The Norden bomb site, treated as a closely guarded secret, promised unprecedented accuracy, able, in theory, to place bombs within a few hundred feet from altitude. To American planners, daylight bombing was not recklessness, it was necessity. Precision required visibility. When the 8th Air Force began operations from Britain in 1942, the gap between theory and reality was immediate. Crews faced weather, navigation errors, flak that reached higher than expected, and German fighters that attacked with coordination and experience. Losses mounted. Schweinfurt in Regensburg in 1943 became bywords for sacrifice, missions where dozens of bombers failed to return. Inside Allied councils, doubts spread. British commanders pressed for the abandonment of daylight raids. Even some American leaders questioned whether the doctrine could survive contact with a defended continent. The German High Command watched these debates with interest and satisfaction. To them, the Americans appeared trapped by their own ideas, flying predictable routes at fixed altitudes, bound to formation discipline. They seemed almost cooperative targets. German intelligence tracked bomber losses carefully. Fighter aces were celebrated, flak units expanded. Each raid reinforced the belief that the enemy would exhaust himself. Meanwhile, German industry adapted. Plants were dispersed. Production shifted underground where possible. Repair crews became as essential as assembly workers. When bombs fell on ball bearing plants or aircraft factories, output dipped, then recovered. Speer's ministry compiled statistics showing resilience. These numbers circulated upward, reinforcing complacency. Yet, beneath the surface, American strategy was evolving. The combined bomber offensive formalized in 1943 aligned British night bombing with American daylight attacks. The goal was no longer harassment or attrition alone, but systematic pressure. Operation Point Blank directed bombers towards targets that sustained German air power itself, aircraft factories, engine works, and increasingly the fuel that fed them. By late 1943, a crucial variable shifted. Long-range fighter escorts, most notably the P-51 Mustang, began accompanying bombers deep into Germany. For the first time, American formations were not alone over their targets.
The Luftwaffe's defenders faced not only incoming bombers, but sustained air combat on the way in and out. Still, within German leadership circles, confidence endured. The focus remained on aircraft numbers, pilot claims, and bomb damage assessments. Fuel production figures were watched, but rarely feared. Synthetic plants had been hit before, they had been repaired before. The assumption was simple. Bombing could inconvenience Germany, but not immobilize it. What the High Command underestimated was not American persistence or even American industry, it was the precision of American choice. And soon, that choice would narrow to a single, irreplaceable target.
From the air, the war over Germany looked almost orderly. Formation boxes held their shape, bombers maintained altitude, checklists were followed. But beneath this apparent structure, the campaign fractured into deeply human experiences on both sides of the bomb site. For American crews, the oil targets carried a different weight. Ball-bearing plants and aircraft factories felt abstract, but refineries were unmistakable. Vast complexes of pipes, towers, and storage tanks spread across the landscape like exposed organs. When hit, they burned. Thick black smoke climbed thousands of feet, visible from miles away. Crews spoke of the smell, oil fires producing a sharp chemical sting that followed them back across the continent. Each mission was methodical, yet personal. Men learned the names of plants, Leuna, Merseburg, Politz, not as industrial sites, but as places where losses were heavy and flak was precise. Crews noticed patterns, stronger defenses, tighter fighter response. These were not random targets, they mattered. On the ground, German industrial workers experienced the campaign differently. Synthetic fuel plants ran day and night, their operations complex and fragile. A single damaged compressor or distillation column could halt production across an entire facility. Workers slept near their stations. Repair crews became permanent fixtures. Shifts blurred together. Each air raid forced decisions. Repair now or evacuate, risk lives or lose output. Within the German leadership, a quieter conflict unfolded. Albert Speer saw the danger earlier than most. Production charts told him what speeches did not. Each successful raid caused longer interruptions. Replacement machinery took time. Skilled labor was irreplaceable. In private memoranda, Speer warned that sustained attacks on fuel would have consequences far beyond temporary shortages. Göring dismissed these concerns. He focused on the air battle, not the supply chain. Bombers could be shot down. Fighters could be built. The Luftwaffe, he insisted, remained capable of defending the Reich. Technology itself became a point of faith. German radar, flak predictors, and interceptor tactics were praised as solutions. American technology, bombers, bomb sites, escort fighters, was acknowledged but not feared. Each side believed machinery would carry the argument. What neither side could yet fully see was how these perspectives would converge. The men and the bombers, the workers and the plants, and the leaders studying their charts were moving toward the same moment, one where belief would give way to arithmetic, and the numbers were beginning to tilt. As the oil campaign intensified, the war shifted from clashes of aircraft to contests between systems, networks of supply, repair, and endurance stretched toward their limits. German air defenses were formidable but finite. Each raid consumed ammunition, fuel, and trained personnel. Flak guns required shells manufactured elsewhere, transported by rail already under pressure. Fighters burned precious aviation gasoline simply to reach altitude. Pilots trained on shortened schedules. Replacement aircraft rolled off assembly lines faster than pilots could master them. The Luftwaffe began to feel a contradiction at its core. To defend fuel, it had to spend fuel. American planners, watching this dynamic, adjusted tactics with cold precision. Bombing schedules targeted repair cycles. A plant struck, repaired, and struck again became less productive than one destroyed outright. The aim was not total annihilation, but cumulative paralysis. Even brief interruptions, repeated often enough, collapsed output. The technological angle sharpened this pressure. The P-51 Mustang altered the balance, not by overwhelming numbers, but by persistence. German fighters could no longer wait near targets, they were engaged en route. Fuel consumption rose, losses climbed. Veteran pilots were lost in skies that had once been their advantage. On the ground, German engineers fought a losing battle against complexity. Synthetic fuel plants were not simple structures. They relied on precise sequencing, temperature, pressure, catalysts. Damage to one segment rippled outward. Improvised repairs introduced inefficiencies. Production resumed, but at reduced quality and volume. Aviation gasoline became scarce. Lower-grade fuels reached units that required precision performance. Morale followed logistics. Factory workers endured constant alarms. Fighter pilots counted remaining flight hours. Panzer commanders reported training exercises curtailed. Each level of the system felt the strain differently, but unmistakably. Leadership responses diverged. Speer pressed for concentration of defenses around oil. Hitler, increasingly distrustful of technical assessments, demanded production miracles. Göring promised results he could no longer deliver. Meetings became defensive, blame shifted, time shortened. By early 1944, the American bombing effort had become something the German command had not fully anticipated, a sustained, rational assault on motion itself, not cities, not symbols, movement. Aircraft grounded by lack of fuel were as defeated as those shot down. Tanks without gasoline were immobile fortresses. Even victory at the front required supply behind it. These realities converged toward a moment when theory would collapse into fact. The decisive phase was approaching, not as a single raid, but as a sequence that would expose the Reich's most dangerous weakness.
May 1944 marked a quiet but profound shift in the air war over Europe. Until then, oil targets had been struck intermittently, important but not dominant. That changed as Allied planners reviewed intelligence with increasing clarity. Aerial reconnaissance photographs showed the same truth repeated across the Reich. Aircraft factories could be dispersed, ball-bearing production could be improvised, but synthetic fuel plants remained large, fixed, and irreplaceable. They could be repaired, they could not be hidden. The decision was deliberate. Oil would no longer be a secondary objective. It would become the center of gravity. On May 12, 1944, more than 900 American bombers crossed into Germany with a focus that left little ambiguity. Leuna, the largest synthetic fuel complex in the Reich, was struck with unprecedented weight. Merseburg followed. So did Brooks and Lützgendorf. Bomb loads were calculated not for area damage, but for disruption, aimed at cracking towers, power stations, and hydrogenation units essential to production flow. The results were immediate and unsettling. Leuna's output fell by more than half in a single day. Fires burned uncontrollably. Repair crews worked under smoke so thick it darkened the sky at noon. Photographs taken days later showed twisted steel where precision machinery had once operated within tight tolerances. German reports still emphasized recovery. Speer's ministry mobilized resources. Thousands of workers were redirected. Spare parts were cannibalized from lesser facilities. Production, on paper, resumed. But the numbers no longer behaved as expected. Each return strike landed sooner than anticipated. Plants were hit again before full repairs were completed. Damage compounded. Power interruptions delayed restarts. Pipelines leaked. Trained engineers were killed or exhausted. The tempo denied equilibrium. The Luftwaffe responded with urgency. Fighter groups were redeployed to protect oil regions, flak density increased, but the defense revealed its own limits. Interceptors scrambled repeatedly, burning fuel at an accelerating rate. Losses mounted against escorting Mustangs that now roamed freely above and beyond targets. By June, German aviation gasoline production had dropped to a fraction of its spring levels. Units reported shortages not in weeks, but in days. Training flights were canceled, operational missions were rationed. Commanders were instructed to conserve fuel, even as the Allied invasion of Western Europe approached. Inside the high command, tone began to change. Speer warned that without fuel, weapons were meaningless. Göring deflected, still promising air superiority. Hitler demanded countermeasures without accepting constraints. Meetings grew tense, confidence fractured, quietly at first. What had begun as a campaign was becoming a condition. The bombers returned again and again, not chasing destruction, but enforcing absence. And with each grounded aircraft, each silent engine, the implications spread outward, towards the front lines and towards the fate of the war itself.
By the summer of 1944, the evidence was no longer abstract. It was measurable, it was operational, and it was irreversible. German fuel production collapsed, not in a single dramatic plunge, but in a relentless descent. In April, synthetic plants still delivered enough aviation gasoline to sustain limited operations. By July, output had fallen to a level that made planning itself unreliable. Charts showed gaps where numbers once stood. Forecasts were abandoned. The system had lost predictability. The Luftwaffe felt the impact first. Fighter units that had once trained daily now flew only when absolutely necessary. Pilots with hundreds of combat hours found themselves grounded, conserving fuel for moments deemed decisive. New pilots arrived at the front having logged dangerously few hours in the air. Accidents increased, confidence eroded. Airfields became quiet places. Engines sat idle under camouflage nets. Aircraft were dispersed, not to evade bombs, but because there was no fuel to concentrate them. Commanders began choosing which units would fly at all. Air defense, once layered and aggressive, thinned unevenly. Gaps appeared. On the ground, the effects multiplied. Panzer divisions reported training curtailed to a minimum. Armored formations conserved fuel for hypothetical counterattacks that never came. Trucks stood empty in motor pools. Even basic movement became conditional. Orders were issued, then delayed, then rescinded, not because of enemy pressure, but because fuel allotments failed to arrive. Speer later described this period with rare clarity. In internal assessments, he acknowledged that the bombing of fuel plants had achieved what years of blockade and battle had not. It had immobilized the German war machine. Weapons existed, men remained, but motion, the ability to concentrate, maneuver, and respond, was gone. The High Command, which had once dismissed American bombing as inefficient, now confronted its consequences daily. Göring's assurances rang hollow. His own Luftwaffe could not meet its obligations. Hitler, increasingly isolated, demanded miracles while rejecting the premises that made them impossible. Attempts at recovery failed. Emergency dispersal projects produced minimal output. Underground facilities came too late. Each new initiative consumed time the Reich no longer had. The bombers continued to return. By late summer, Allied air supremacy was no longer a matter of contest, it was an environment. German fighters rose only when necessary, and often not at all. Reconnaissance aircraft roamed freely. The sky belonged to those who could afford to move through it. The decisive moment had passed quietly, without a single surrender or announcement. Germany had lost the ability to fight a modern war at modern speed. What followed would not reverse that loss.
it would expose it.
The consequences of the oil campaign unfolded across every layer of the German war effort. By late 1944, the immediate tactical impact was undeniable. Aircraft grounded, armored divisions immobilized, and mechanized supply chains disrupted. But the deeper effects reached into strategy, morale, and the very calculations of the high command. The Reich's armored forces, the Wehrmacht's pride, were the first to reveal the severity of fuel shortages. Panzer divisions that once moved with the precision of clockwork now advanced in fits and starts. Exercises meant to maintain combat readiness were canceled. Fuel rationing forced commanders to prioritize certain units over others, creating gaps along critical fronts. The Ardennes, during the famous Winter Offensive, became a stark example. The initial thrust of tanks and mechanized units depended on fuel scavenged from existing depots. Progress slowed when supplies failed to arrive, leaving units exposed and vulnerable to counterattacks. For the Luftwaffe, the consequences were equally severe. Without sufficient fuel, even elite fighter wings could not maintain patrols or intercept Allied bombers effectively. Pilots were grounded, training halted, and the air defense network fragmented. In reports compiled by German intelligence, the words "critical shortage" began appearing repeatedly, reflecting a system where strategy was dictated by scarcity rather than choice. Where the Reich had once promised air dominance, it now faced strategic impotence. Albert Speer, in his wartime diaries and post-war analyses, chronicled the cumulative toll. He noted that the combined effect of repeated strikes on Leuna, Merseburg, and other synthetic plants had produced a systemic failure unmatched by conventional bombing elsewhere. Factories rebuilt rapidly, but their output was constrained by the absence of fuel. Aircraft could be produced, tanks assembled, and troops trained, but without motion, all material superiority was moot. On the operational level, Allied commanders recognized the value of this campaign. The destruction of fuel infrastructure had created an environment where tactical gains could be amplified. A single breakthrough, once fueled and reinforced, now became decisive because German reserves could not respond. American and British strategists had effectively weaponized logistics itself, turning production nodes into front-line factors. The strategic equation shifted. Fewer Allied casualties, greater operational mobility, and steadily increasing pressure on the Reich. Even within Hitler's inner circle, the impact became undeniable. Meetings of the OKW, once confident and dismissive, shifted toward defensive urgency. Göring, whose pride had long rested on the Luftwaffe's invincibility, faced a reality he could not reverse. The air arm could no longer fulfill its obligations, leaving German cities exposed and the front-line forces vulnerable. Hitler's demands grew increasingly erratic, disconnected from the operational capacity of his forces. Frustration, denial, and panic began to dominate decision-making. In essence, the oil campaign had transformed the war not through singular destruction, but through systemic attrition. The Americans had demonstrated that precision, persistence, and understanding the enemy's critical vulnerabilities could achieve effects far greater than mass bombing or mass casualties. By the end of 1944, the Reich's strategic mobility, the ability to maneuver, respond, and sustain itself, was effectively neutralized. What remained was a Reich unable to operate at the speed of modern war, its forces stranded not by guns, but by the absence of fuel.
By autumn 1944, the war for Germany had become a struggle against scarcity itself. The destruction of synthetic fuel plants did not merely inconvenience the Wehrmacht, it dictated the pace of every operation and ultimately shaped the final campaigns of the Reich. Armored divisions, once capable of rapid thrusts and encirclements, were forced to halt at the edge of terrain they could not traverse without gasoline. Tanks and half-tracks remained parked in fields or depots, their crews idle, waiting for supplies that would never arrive. Mechanized infantry units, unable to maintain tempo, fell behind, exposing flanks to Allied pressure.
In France, the rapid Allied advance after D-Day capitalized on these weaknesses. German forces could resist in local pockets, but they could not regroup or mount sustained counteroffensives. The Luftwaffe, already crippled by losses, now faced an insurmountable obstacle: fuel shortages, grounded aircraft that might have otherwise contested Allied air supremacy. Fighter wings that could have challenged bombing missions or reconnaissance flights simply could not launch. Pilot training programs were curtailed, leaving replacements underprepared. The skies over Germany became a nearly unbroken corridor for Allied bombers, reconnaissance planes, and transports. American and British forces moved through these corridors with almost complete operational freedom, shaping both morale and logistics on the ground. Even the famed Ardennes offensive, the last great German attempt to seize initiative, suffered directly from the lack of fuel. Tanks ran out of gasoline at critical points. Armored spearheads stalled in dense forests. Fuel shortages forced commanders to abandon ambitious plans, retreating from objectives even when they initially gained ground. Speer noted bitterly that without fuel, the weapons were no more than statues. The statistical picture tells the same story. By late 1944, German aviation gasoline production had fallen to less than half of 1943 levels. Motorized transport consumed what little remained. Infantry units were forced to march where vehicles once carried them. Supply convoys dwindled. Logistics became the limiting factor, not combat effectiveness. Numbers alone could no longer determine operational outcomes. Without fuel, forces were inert. Psychologically, the impact was profound. Commanders confronted a new reality. No plan could succeed if movement itself was constrained. Morale among frontline troops suffered as shortages dictated orders, while rear echelon units saw chaos spreading into previously secure zones. The confidence of the high command, once buoyed by production statistics and organizational ingenuity, was replaced by frustration, misjudgment, and the growing awareness that their ability to wage modern war had been fatally compromised. The Allied campaign continued with near impunity, capitalizing on mobility, air superiority, and logistics to overwhelm German positions. Every raid on oil infrastructure compounded the paralysis, turning systemic vulnerability into decisive advantage. By early 1945, Germany's war machine was no longer operational. It existed as an incomplete skeleton of its former capacity, a war in stasis, enforced not by enemy occupation alone, but by the absence of fuel to drive its engines. The stage was set for the final collapse. Without motion, the Reich could not resist. And yet, amid this paralysis, the lessons of precision, persistence, and industrial targeting had been learned, not in theory, but in the harsh arithmetic of reality.
The story of Germany's oil crisis in 1944 is a testament to the quiet power of logistics in modern warfare. War is often imagined as a clash of armies, a contest of courage and weapons. But here, the decisive weapon was absence, the deliberate removal of fuel that made machines move, engines run, and decisions possible. Precision bombing, persistence, and calculated targeting turned an industrial vulnerability into operational paralysis. It also exposed the cost of miscalculation. German leadership had dismissed the threat of American bombing, confident that courage, tactics, and repair crews could absorb any damage. That confidence had ignored a simple fact: modern war is not won solely by numbers, guns, or territory, but by motion. Without fuel, mobility vanished, and with it, the capacity to fight. Machines, men, and strategy alike became inert. For the men flying the missions, for the workers struggling to repair damage, and for commanders forced to confront scarcity, the lesson was clear. Every component of war is interdependent. The collapse of one critical node, the synthetic fuel plants, reshaped the battlefield in ways no single battle could. It turned fire into paralysis, power into impotence, and ambition into immobility. In a broader sense, the campaign revealed a new truth about warfare.
Industrial infrastructure is as decisive as frontline valor, and strategic vision can outweigh brute force. The war over Germany's oil left a legacy far beyond the smoke rising from Leuna or Merseburg. It demonstrated that victory can be achieved not just by fighting the enemy, but by undermining the very systems that allow him to fight at all. History remembers the battles, the armies, the leaders, but here it is the silent engines that tell the story. Motion halted, opportunity seized, and a war reshaped not by spectacular explosions alone, but by the absence of fuel that powered it.